Did the other world influence the events sa Táin Bó Cuailnge? Well, Dagdy Evogus Falcha. Hi, hello, and welcome to Jon O'Sullivan, the Irish Pagan School. And this is a cast or question that I was wondering quite a bit about because when we look at Ireland's mythology and our past, there's the different academic structures or cycles. So there's the mythological cycle, which deals mainly with the Tuatha Danann, the gods of Ireland. And then we move into the Ulster Cycle, which is the cycle of like heroes and monsters. And that's where we find the central epic saga being the Táin Bó Cuailnge, the cattle raid of Cooley. But for all of the fact that it's a conflict between Connacht and Ulster, between Queen Maeve and Concover of Ulster, there is a lot of other world elements which can sometimes go amiss or get ignored. And so, looking into that question and exploring that, I actually did pull together an entire class, which is on the Irish Pagan School about it, and called the Other World in the Ulster Cycle. But there are a number of different linchpin moments that almost ensure that the Táin Bó Cuailnge is going to happen, and those linchpin moments come from the other world influences on Ullid, or the tribe of Ulster. So the most notable one, I suppose, is during the Táin Bó Cúailnge, it said that the only warrior who is fit for combat to defend Ulster is, of course, Satanta Mac Sualtam, also known as Cú Chulainn. So Cú Chulainn being this lone hero, it's a well-known trope in it, but even though he's not exactly a hero, I have other videos on that. But the question why is something we have to consider. Why was Cuchulainn the only person viable to defend Ulster against invasion? And it's because of otherworld influence. In order to understand that, we have to go back to a rave scale or a before story, which talks about Macha. Macha being one of the women of the other world who comes into the Ulster tribe and she decides that wants to spend a life with someone. And so she marries and weds a famous farmer, actually an impoverished farmer at the time, but through her skill and ability, he becomes wealthy. And because of his wealth, he's invited to the seat of the King of Ulster at the point. And you may or may not know the details of it, but the only prohibition she puts on him is don't tell anyone about me, which is core kind of classic information that we see about Ban She or women of the She, also Lannan She or fairy lovers or she lovers. And so in this instance, she lives with him, he becomes abundant, she bears children for him, and she's pregnant with his children at the time that he's invited to this booze up with the King of Ulster. And yeah, he falls into his cups, he brags about his beautiful wife and how amazing she is and how she could outrun the king's horses. Of course, the king, not having truck with this guy bragging in his own court, drags Macha up and forces her to race against the horses. The linchpin moment here is the fact that Macha pleads. Macha pleads not to her husband, not to the king. She pleads to all of the men of Ulster, all of you, anyone here. Will anyone speak up for me? And of course, no one will. So Mach is forced to raise the horses in a heavily pregnant state. She wins because she's an otherworld goddess figure. She makes it to the finish line, beating the horses, but then falls there to give birth to the children. And with her birthing as well as her death, she curses 9 generations of the men of Ulster that should and when Ulster needs them most, they will fall sick with the pangs of bearing children. So when we get to the Táin Bó Cúailnge generations later, it's still within the 9 generation curse of Macha, and this otherworld influence sets the table for Táin Bó Cúailnge and this central figure of Cú Chulainn. It's not because he's particularly special, even though he is semi-divine in his own way. It's because all of the other men of Ulster didn't actually stand up and represent properly for Macha. Now, next, of course, there are a number of, this isn't the only influence that we can see from the other world stories. We have to talk about the bulls as well. There's the Dun Cúailnge, the brown of Cooley, and the Fionn Vanach, the white bull of Connacht. But there's another cow here which falls into the mix, and we find this cow in the Táin Bó Cuailnge. So there's another rouse tale, another pre-story known as the Táin Bó Cuailnge, the cattle raid of Rogavan. And in this, we have a cow being brought from the otherworld. So it's not just the deities, it's not just other influences, it's actually the creatures of the other world who are also involved in this narrative. And the cow belongs to none other than the Connacht hero Necta. Apologies, Nera. So Actra Nera is one of the pre-stories in the Ulster Cycle. Nera goes into the other world and lives there for a while with his own Lannan she, or woman or lover of the she. She bears him children, and his child has a cow. The Morrigan comes and takes that cow out of the other world and brings it into our world. And through that process, she takes that cow to the Dún Cuailnge, so it will be covered by the Dún Cuailnge and conceive. During the Táin Bó Cuailnge, she is traveling across Ulster with this cow from the other world, and she comes across none other than Cú Chulainn. And so there is this, excuse me, back and forth narrative between them, which is quite difficult because it's Cú Chulainn being an ass, to be honest, but more on that at a different time. It is a very fascinating one to a rave scale or pre-story to look into. And it speaks a lot about the relationship of Cú Chulainn and the Morrigan in the animosity way, but also in her testing and judgment of him. So with this, she's bringing this cow from the other world. Cú Chulainn is claiming all the cows in Ulster are under his care and protection. He's making claims that he is entitled to harass or stop the Morrigan in her journey, but she isn't really having it at all. And so this cow and the transport of this cow means that later in the aftermath of the Táin Bó Cuailnge, this calf or this young bull that is born of this covering child of the Dún Cuailnge also comes into the narrative later on. So there is another influence here of the other world, and in specific this time, the Morrigan. But the Morrigan is throughout the Táin Bó Cuailnge and also throughout the Ulster Cycle. Time and again, we see her influences. We see her interacting and testing and judging and providing conflict with Cú Chulainn or with Setanta. It's not romance. It's not like she's into him or a spurned lover or any of that stuff that other people had presented in the past. It's been suggested specifically by my partner Laura that what is happening here is the Morrigan, in her role as a goddess of sovereignty, is judging and testing Cú Chulainn to test his worth. But I'm sure Laura will have more of that in the future. Or in fact, if you are following along, my partner Laura has written a book about the Morrigan, which will be coming out from Llewellyn Publishing later in 2005. So if you're seeing this now, when it's released, it's in the future. If you happen to catch this in the future, definitely look up the book. So the Curse of Macha sets up one side of it. There is the influence of the cows, but there's so many other important parts. Even when we touch on Setanta Maxultum himself, Cú Chulainn, he is in some way an otherworld being himself. He is touched by the other world from before his birth and then into his actually birth, and it's believed that he is said to be a demigod. He is the child of the god Lu. When we see the preparing for Cú Chulainn or Setanta when he's going off to train and become the best warrior he can be, he does get separated from his other warriors and he's lost in this magical mist. And Lu actually comes for him later on to protect him and to help him and to get him back on his journey. Not comes to put him in his place, although maybe Lu should have. Later on, during the Táin Bó Cuailnge, there's actually a version of it that mentions, or the recension that mentions that Cú Chulainn is totally buckled after a hard day of fighting, and a beautiful warrior comes up to him and goes, "Okay, I'll stand in your place until you're recovered," and that warrior is said to be Lu. So even when we get to the main core conflicts in the Táin Bó Cuailnge during the invasion or the battles with the pretty much all the men of Ireland, because Queen Maeve, it wasn't just Connacht, she has allegiances, and she had the right to call pretty much all of the men of Ireland to her banner to deal with this conflict against Ulster. And for all of that, some of them end up actually fighting Lu instead of fighting Cú Chulainn. So time and again, there are many different steps and stages of otherworldly influence during the Ulster cycle that do set up the core saga that is the Táin Bó Cuailnge. The question is, of course, from then, is it that the other world pulled away? We see less other world influences, but not gone into the Fenian cycle. And then when we move down into the fourth cycle, the cycle of kings, it is more historical figures to a certain degree, but semi-mythological figures who do claim descendancy from members of the Tuatha De Danann. So the other world influences is still actually there, but it's worth taking time to look back at these stories, to look back at the influences of it, because at the time of the Ulster cycle, otherworld influence was well understood. It was accepted. It was part of the natural process of existing in Ireland. And in fact, it was banked on for right rule. So if a king or ruler wanted to kind of step up, they had to make sure that they had an allegiance or that they were in right relationship with the deities of sovereignty so that Ireland would be made preserved and made abundant by that healthy relationship with our world and the other world. So did the other world pull away from us? Much like, galaxies are separating in our universe? Or is it that we as people turned our attention away from what has always been right beside us, what has always been parallel to our existence? Worth considering. If you'd like to know more, there's a link to a class there. Again, the other world influences in the Ulster Cycle at the Irish Pagan School. And until next time, look after yourself. Take care. Agus Slán. Goodbye.